All right, pre-AP biology. We're going to start unit 4 today, which is on the biology of cells. So we're going to talk a lot about cells the next couple of days. So let's kind of go ahead and get started here. All right, now before we kind of get into the structure of cells, I want to review a little bit. It's called the modern cell theory. The modern cell theory really has three parts to it, which are I don't know, I think kind of common sense. Number one, cells are the smallest working units of living things. So that kind of is the same thing as saying you're alive because your cells are alive, which you've heard me say numerous times. Number two, all living things are made of cells. So if it's alive, it has cells. And number three, all cells come from pre existing cells. So every cell in your body, for example, came from another cell. Um, Now, the thing about cells, as we kind of get into this, you're going to find out that there's a lot of different types of cells. I mean, like your body, for example, probably consists of dozens and dozens of different types of cells, right? You've got liver cells and kidney cells and brain cells and skin cells and heart cells, all these different types, right? And their shape sometimes tells you a lot about what they do. We call that form equals function. Like, for example, these are red blood cells, right? They're smooth, um, they're kind of donut shaped. And because they're shaped that way, that allows them to travel through your blood vessels very easily. Think about if they were like sickle shaped, right? We've talked about sickle cell anemia before, I think a little bit. um, then they wouldn't travel through your blood vessels very well. So if they had any other shape other than this, they probably wouldn't be able to do their job. This is a sperm cell. I mean, think about what a sperm cell does. Like, what is its function, right? It has to swim right to the egg. I mean, so think about how it's built. It has this big long tail to help it propel itself and swim and deposit all of its DNA to the egg cell. If it was shaped any other way, it probably wouldn't be able to do its job very well. These are plant cells, right? Plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts and all that type of stuff. So they have their own distinct shape as well. But every cell is unique. Every cell is different from the others. They all do very specific jobs. But pretty much, we can divide cells into two different categories. Prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells. You've heard me use those terms before. Prokaryotic, just think bacteria. Prokaryotic cells are very simple. They're unicellular organisms. Eukaryotic cells are a lot more complex. They've got all these organelles inside. In comparison to prokaryotic cells, which don't. Animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotic cells. So here's just kind of a list of prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells and some of the things I kind of want you to know about each one. Prokaryotic are smaller than eukaryotic, even though all cells are small. But I mean, think of like a golf ball compared to a basketball. That's kind of the size difference, I guess, between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells don't have any organelles. Eukaryotic cells do. Prokaryotes don't have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do. Prokaryotic cells are what we call non-specialized, whereas eukaryotic are specialized. Now, what I mean by specialized is, for example, like in your body, like you are a eukaryotic organism, and your cells are specialized. That's because each cell has a certain job, right? Your liver cells do certain things. Your heart cells do certain things. Your brain cells do certain things. You are a specialized organism. Okay, your cells are specialized. Prokaryotic cells are independent, which means they don't need other cells to survive. Whereas in a eukaryotic organism like your cells are dependent on other cells. So like your brain cells depend on your red blood cells, for example. Your skin cells depend on your heart cells. Your heart cells pump blood to every part of your body, including your skin, right? So just remember, these are just the opposite of each other. And also remember that bacteria are the only prokaryotic cells. Everything else is eukaryotic. All right. Cell factory. I like to compare cells to a factory. For example, in a regular, let's say it's a car factory, right? You've got people and machines that are doing jobs, whereas in a cell, you have organelles that do those jobs. So we're going to talk about all the different organelles. We'll get into most of them tomorrow. Today, I want to talk about just a couple of them. Um, but before we kind of get into that, I do want us to understand kind of what the end game is of of a cell. Like what do cells produce? All factories produce a product, right? A candy factory produces candy. A pencil factory produces pencils. A car factory produces cars. What does the cell factory produce? It produces proteins. Remember that. All cells produce proteins. Now, not every cell produces the same proteins, right? I mean, like your liver cells make different proteins than your white blood cells do. But one thing we have to remember about proteins is what proteins are made of. You might remember this from the previous unit, right? Proteins are made of amino acids. Do you remember how many different amino acids there are? There are 20 of them. All right. So if your cells are going to build proteins, they need amino acids to do that. Where do you get your amino acids from? You get them from food. So remember this, you need to eat protein in order to make proteins. So when you eat protein, your body breaks it down into amino acids, and then your body can use those amino acids to build whatever proteins it needs. All right, so that's kind of an important concept. But cells make proteins, they need amino acids to do so. Let's talk about the cell membrane. Right, the cell membrane is the kind of the door to the cell. A couple things to remember about the cell membrane. Number one is that it's semi-permeable. That means it allows some things to come in, other things it doesn't allow to come in. So it's kind of like a screen door. Like some things can pass through it, other things can't. I also want you to know this term, because this is kind of the scientific term for the cell membrane. It's called the phospholipid bilayer. All right, whenever you see the term phospholipid bilayer, all right, we're talking about the cell membrane. I will be referring to it a lot as the phospholipid bilayer. So let's take a look at the phospholipid bilayer. So let's say this is a cell. All right, but this is kind of the inside of the cell here. And then this is the outside of the cell. Now, one thing that you'll notice about this cell, in fact, almost all cells are like this, there's a lot of water on the inside of your cells, and there's a lot of water on the outside of your cells. So this layer, we call this the phospholipid bilayer. And notice how it's two layers of these little molecules here. These are called phospholipids, by the way. So there's like a layer right here, kind of an inner layer. And then there's kind of this outer layer here. Okay. But you'll notice again that there's water, all over the place, all on the inside, all on the outside of the cell. So I want us to kind of understand a little bit about the structure of these molecules and kind of how they're structured this way. So let's take a look at an individual phospholipid molecule. So it kind of looks like this. Got this little head to it, got this little tail to it. Now the head is what we call a polar head. Okay, so I'm going to go back real quick to this. You notice how, for example, you see this bilayer here, and you'll see how all these, see on the inner layer here, all the heads are facing inwards. They're facing like kind of towards the water. Whereas in the outer layer, those heads are facing out. They're facing towards the water. Now, the reason why that is because this little part of the molecule is what we call hydrophilic. Now, let's break that term down. The term hydro, what does that mean? It means water, right? Philic is the opposite of phobic. So phobic means that it like hates something. It doesn't like something, right? Philic means that it loves something. It's attracted to something. So this little head right here is attracted to water. It loves water. So if you go back to this picture, it kind of makes sense that all of these phospholipids here, they're all facing towards the water. They're all facing inwards. And these ones on the outside here, these are all facing the other direction because they're facing the water on the outside of the cell. Okay, so it kind of helps us understand why they're aligned that way. Now, the other part of the molecule is the tail. The tail is hydrophobic. So that means that it doesn't like water. So you'll notice, you see how, like this little cross section right here, you see how the tails are all facing inwards, like towards each other. That's because they're afraid of water. They're facing the other way. They don't want to face the water. Remember, there's water on the inside, there's water on the outside, and those tails don't want anything to do with that water. So the tails are all kind of facing inwards, away from the water. So I want us to understand why those molecules are aligned that way. All right, that's the phospholipid bilayer. Now, this picture kind of shows us, it's kind of similar. You see these little purple guys, those are the phospholipids. And like down in here, for example, let's say this is the inside of the cell. And then up here, this would be the outside of the cell up in here. But again, you'll notice, see the tails, how they're facing kind of towards each other. You got all these, phosphate heads facing the water here. You have all these phosphate heads facing the water out here. So again, right there, this is your bilayer. That's your phospholipid bilayer. But you'll also notice that there's a bunch of these other structures kind of embedded within the cell membrane. This whole thing is the cell membrane. The phospholipid bilayer is all these little molecules here, but then we have these big structures that also do things. Now there's three different proteins that you see here. One of them is called a channel, and you can probably tell by the structure of it maybe what it does, but we'll talk about it. We also have something called a receptor protein, and the other one is called a marker protein. So I want us to know what each one of these three things does. Let's first talk about the receptor. So here's the receptor protein. Notice how it's kind of embedded, within those phospholipids. Receptor proteins are important because they allow cells to talk to each other. This is really, really important in an organism like us. Like, it's important that, let's say, our liver can talk to our pancreas, or our brain can talk to our liver, whatever. For cells to talk to each other, they have to have a way to communicate. Now, cells send messages to each other. They're called hormones. Here's some examples of some hormones here. Okay, but they send those hormones and they receive those hormones all through these little receptor proteins. So that's a really important thing that your cells have. If your cells didn't have those, then they couldn't communicate with each other, and that wouldn't be very good. So that's a really important thing. Now, another type of protein is called a marker protein. Now, marker proteins, they kind of give your cells an identity. Now, this is actually a really important thing, especially for your immune system. So, I mean, let's go ahead and use the coronavirus, for example. So I'll use myself because I just had coronavirus. So if my body gets corona, my immune system has to fight it, has to fight it off. So that means that my immune cells have to distinguish between self and non-self, right? I mean, my immune system has to understand what's the virus and what isn't. Well, luckily, on my body cells, I have these little markers. They're kind of like little name tags that say, "Hey, I'm Mr. Trappear's liver cells," or "I'm Mr. Trappear's heart cells," or whatever. And those little name tags give my cells an identity. Well, the coronavirus doesn't have my name set. It doesn't have my name tags. It doesn't have my marker proteins. So when the coronavirus gets into my body, my immune system can identify it because it doesn't have the right marker proteins, and eventually my immune system will fight it off. Hopefully, right? That's at least that's the whole point. Another reason why marker proteins are important: um, organ transplants. Like what's the big fear? With an organ transplant is the fear of your body rejecting the organ, right? Like, I mean, why is it that like people just don't get organ transplants a lot more than what you think they do? They have to wait for the right donor, and they have to wait for the right match. Well, what they're looking for is an organ that has similar marker proteins. Now the only person that might have the same exact marker proteins as you would be an identical twin. Um, but other than that, nobody's is the same. So, if let's say, for example, I need a kidney transplant, and let's say one of my students donates a kidney to me, that'd be great. Thank you. Um, if my body doesn't recognize the marker proteins that are on that organ, then my body will reject it. And that basically means that my immune system will kill the organ. So marker proteins are really important because they're what gives your cells an identity. Similar organisms have similar marker proteins, but they're not necessarily always exactly the same. If everybody had the same marker proteins, we can just swap kidneys back and forth all the time without having to worry about rejection, but that's not the case, obviously, right? All right, finally is the channel protein. I mean, if you kind of look at what its shape is, the channel protein is what allows things to pass back and forth. Now, some things can pass through these little phospholipids over here. Like tiny little particles can pass through those, like water and things like that. But like much larger things would need to go through these channels. All right, so the channel protein, I kind of look at a channel protein as like a bouncer in a bar, right? I mean, the channel protein will allow some things to come in, but other things can't come in, right? So the bouncer at the bar, at the front door of the bar, is not going to allow anybody to come through. It'll only allow things to come through that are important or that deserve to be inside, whatever. So this channel protein will open and close, and it's selective about what it allows to pass through. All right, so channel proteins, make sure we understand that. So make sure you know those three proteins, know what they do, what are their functions. All right, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you soon.